There's a strange thing that happens with lactate just as you get to the top of your zone 2 in an exercise test. In this video, we'll look at some data that I collected recently, as well as some research papers to try and understand why lactate goes down before it rises again, especially at low intensities. To get started, let's look at this lactate curve from a running test that I did with my friend David, who's a pretty good runner. Recently, it was actually last week. And what you can see is that over the first 2 or 3 intervals, even though speed increases from 10 kilometers per hour to 11 to 12 to 13, we have that little inflection downwards in lactate. So those are very small variations. I've seen bigger variations in the past, and we have to take into account the measurement error of the device itself. But I consistently see in well-trained endurance athletes this little drop in lactate. It goes from 0.8 at 10 kilometers per hour down to 0.6, up to 0.7, and then up to 0.9, and then it really starts increasing. So to give a little bit of an overview before we dive into this topic, lactate is nothing more than the byproduct of glycolysis. When glucose is broken down, we have lactate that comes out as a result. Pyruvate, yes, and lactate, at least the pyruvate gets switched into lactate quite quickly. And then this lactate can go in multiple directions. It can go straight into the mitochondria of the same muscle cell within which it was produced, so that it can be oxidized. But if the mitochondria can't deal with it, then it can go into the bloodstream and be oxidized in another muscle. It can go into your brain. It could go be used by your heart. It can go back into your liver to get switched back into glucose. So there's many places for this lactate to go. So when we measure lactate inside the blood, it's essentially what's left after we've produced a bunch and we've recycled a bunch as well. And again, we see another example here of a running step test, and we see that same drop as we saw with David before, drop from 0.8 to 0.6, then 0.7, and then it starts going up again. Another point of data that I find really interesting, not even on a running step test or a bike step test. This is a step test that I did with one of the CrossFit athletes that I work with, Jules, and he did this step test with the respiratory device, with the Breathe Way Better, and I measured his lactate at the end of every 2.5 minute stage. And what he did, he started at 15 breaths per minute, and we used breathing frequency as the intensity metric. He obviously tried to keep as much volume as he could on each breath, and we went up 5 breaths each stage. So he did 2.5 minutes at 15 breaths a minute, 30-second break. Then he went up to 2.5 minutes. And at the end of each interval, I measured his lactate. And you can see that we see a similar inflection point downwards before it starts rising again. So it seems like this is a phenomenon that happens even at the respiratory muscle level. But as we can see here, the respiratory muscles do behave a lot like other muscles. I mean, they are muscles. There's not much different with them. We'll come back to this in just a little bit. A piece of information we can add to this graph is the muscle oximetry. So I use multiple Moxies on the people that I test. The Moxie measures the balance between oxygen delivery and oxygen utilization. And what you can see here is that where we see that lactate at the lowest point, when it actually drops after the initial stage of the test, what we can see is maximal SMO2 values. So the number in and of itself doesn't really matter, but the trend matters and the relative value compared to the rest of the test matters. So you can see we have the highest SMO2 values in the test here on those 2 stages at 11 and 12 kilometers per hour. And this is something that we see repeated on this data set here. The Moxie was placed on the rectus femoris, on the quad, for the running test. And we see it again on the intercostals that I was able to measure with the Moxie during this step test as well. So we see that when lactate is low and actually drops, we also see SMO2 levels which are very high, or the highest that we would see on the intensity spectrum. So to understand exactly what's going on, let's dive into oxygen delivery and utilization. So oxygen utilization across the intensity spectrum moves up in a linear fashion, meaning that as intensity goes up, whether it's the speed of running or the watts on a bike, you're going to consume more and more oxygen as you progress throughout the test. So this is the utilization side of things. But we can look at oxygen delivery, and the delivery does not follow exactly the same path. If we were to overlay oxygen delivery here in dark blue, what we would see is that at low intensities, we have more oxygen available than we're going to use. And again, this is manifested by those high SMO2 values as the lactate is really low at the low intensity just before we get out of that zone 2, just before we move beyond the first threshold. Once we get to medium intensities, we have a balance between oxygen delivery and utilization. And then once we go at high intensities and above, the oxygen delivery is not sufficient anymore to come and fuel the muscle because we just don't have the capacity to bring enough of that oxygen in anymore. And for those that are interested in going a little farther, we can look at the W prime as kind of the delta between the oxygen you keep using, because your body keeps using more and more, but you can't bring enough. So obviously you have to go into that systemic oxygen reserve, which is exemplified by the W prime in the critical power model, but we'll come back to this in another video if you want. We can also look at oxygen consumption across the intensity spectrum, because oxygen does not react the same. The kinetics of oxygen are not the same in the different intensity domains. If we look at low intensity, the onset of exercise, we have a VO2 that is quickly going to stabilize itself, and it's going to remain stable for the duration of the effort. If we go to medium intensity, we see a stabilized VO2, but not right away. So it goes up just like it would at low intensity, but then instead of following that dotted line and stabilizing itself, there's kind of a little bump upwards. And this is what we call the VO2 slow component. It seems like there's a tight link between inorganic phosphate and the VO2 slow component. Inorganic phosphate, which is nothing more than a byproduct of the hydrolysis of ATP. So we take ATP, we break it down to ADP or AMP to try and use that potential energy that is in there. And the phosphate group that is left hanging around, this guy comes and wreaks havoc in terms of fatigue, especially when it reaches a certain concentration inside the muscle cell. There's some interesting papers on that. If you're interested, leave me a comment and I'll give you the link to those. And then if you go to high intensity, essentially you cannot stabilize the slow component anymore, because the inorganic phosphate, amongst other things, the accumulation is too fast. You can't deal with it, and you're going to trend towards VO2 max. And at very high intensity, if we want to go there, what happens is usually that we're going to reach task failure before reaching our VO2 max. So those are the 4 different intensity domains, and this is how oxygen is used across the board. Now, let's bring it back to our initial topic of lactate and see what's happening between oxygen and lactate. I'm taking some data from my colleague Elias here that I was lucky to have on the podcast a while back. Please go check out the episode if you haven't yet. And what he did is he did a step test measuring lactate and measuring VO2 with different oxygen partial pressures. So he was able to manipulate the environment. He works in a lab, and he did a test with 15% O2. He did a test with 21% O2, which would be the normal value. And the third one was at 30% O2. And what is really interesting is when you increase the partial pressure of oxygen in the environment, well, what happens, it simply drives itself better into the muscle cell, right? Because if you think about the travel of oxygen from the environment down into the muscle cell, I talk about this in my recent VO2 max presentation, but essentially it's the pressure differential between the environment, the outside environment, and our internal environment all the way down to the muscle cell, the gradient of pressure that's going to drive oxygen down into the cell. So if we can push more oxygen in by increasing that gradient, by increasing that partial pressure on the outside, well, what do we see? We increase our performance. And he measured his second threshold at 205 watts when he was at 15% oxygen, 246 watts at 21% oxygen, and up to 270 watts when he was at 30% oxygen. So we can really understand here the importance of oxygen transport and delivery into the muscle cell And the more oxygen you can drive into the cell, the better you're going to do in terms of endurance performance. Now let's go to a really great graph from an Inigo San Milan study. And what you see here is different lactate trends, different lactate curves with different populations. So he tested some people that had metabolic syndrome, some active individuals, and some professional cyclists. And what's interesting is you can really see the difference in the trend of the curve. And even maybe more interesting than the blood lactate is we can look at fat oxidation, because he measured that as well. And what we see here is that the metabolic syndrome in a demographic or group had really low fat oxidation in terms of absolute levels, and it would drop really fast as exercise intensity increased. The active individuals started a little bit higher, but dropped pretty fast as well. But it's really the pro cyclists that saw the biggest amount of fat being oxidized per minute, and you can really see that that curve that goes up and then comes back down. And that can start to give us an idea of what's going on with lactate at low intensities and why it drops, especially in highly trained individuals. And for this, all we have to do is overlay all those different data points. And what we can see is that fat oxidation and lactate seem to mirror each other quite a bit. It's not exact. It doesn't mirror itself all the way up to the maximal intensities, but especially around low intensities, it seems like they're really kind of working together. And one concept that is most likely wrong, but I find really interesting, is this idea of lack of pyruvate that we find in the Motter and Heck model of bioenergetics all the way back to 1986. I highly recommend you read this paper if you haven't. There's a bunch of things that are probably inaccurate, and it's probably an oversimplification. It is most likely an oversimplification of cellular bioenergetics, but I find it really interesting to think about this idea of lack of pyruvate. And the idea here is that essentially, the more mitochondrial capacity you have, the more fat you're going to use. And this is something we saw in the graphs just before from Inigo San Milan. The pro cyclists have a huge mitochondrial capacity, and they're able to oxidize a lot more fats and at a much higher intensity compared to the normal population. Here, I'm not talking about fat oxidation on long rides or on long events or on repeated types of intervals across time. We're really talking about the context of an incremental step test and looking at why the lactate drops before it goes back up in trained individuals. And I think that we can start to understand why this is going on with this concept of lack of pyruvate that I'm going to explain using this graph from another study that I referenced down on the left here. So what do we see here? We see a muscle cell in brown. We see the mitochondria in yellow at the bottom. And we see the different pathways, fat oxidation on the left, glycolysis in the middle. And then on the right, we have the phosphocreatine shuttle. We have the electron transport chain inside the mitochondria. And what we can see is that whether the material for the Krebs cycle, for the TCA cycle inside the mitochondrial matrix, comes from glycolysis or fat oxidation, it doesn't change much, right? Everything goes through acetyl-CoA or becomes acetyl-CoA in one way or another, and then that goes into the TCA and feeds the electron transport chain with the NADH and FADH2. So it doesn't really matter where it comes from, but what we can start to understand with what we saw in the previous data that I showed you is that we have that fat oxidation, but it seems like glycolysis is at the center of the conversation here, and whether we activate glycolysis a lot or not seems to be an important factor in how much fat we're going to use. And we'll come back on the glycolysis activation just after, but essentially you're going to break down the sugars and you're going to get pyruvate like we see here. It's going to move into lactate, and some of this is going to go into the mitochondria. There's an arrow missing from the lactate here on the right. There is also a transfer from the lactate into the mitochondria, as we can see with the pyruvate. Then it does get transformed back into pyruvate and then goes and gets transformed to acetyl-CoA. But essentially, it's and that's a hypothesis, right? A working hypothesis. But based on the previous data we saw, I think that makes sense. If we're not activating glycolysis, given the internal state of the muscle cell. Then we still need a substrate in order to fuel that TCA cycle and fuel the electron transport chain, because the work is being done. The phosphocreatine is being depleted. It needs to be replenished through the mitochondrial process. And so this is going to run no matter what. But if glycolysis isn't turned on, let's say, well, it's got to come from somewhere. And it seems like that might be something to investigate. Whereas if glycolysis is not activated, the body's going to use more fats as a substrate. Again, in the context of a step test, not in the context of a longer effort, where the dynamics between glycolysis and fat oxidation are quite different, actually. And we could probably do another video on this. If you're interested, leave me a comment below. Small detail, this part of the phosphocreatine shuttle actually happens inside the mitochondria, not outside. This is something that I learned recently and that I found really interesting. We always talk about the phosphocreatine system on the utilization side, right? How it puts ATP back together to help fuel muscle contractions. But where phosphocreatine itself is put back together is inside the mitochondria, directly linked to the mitochondrial ATP. So phosphocreatine is directly dependent on the aerobic system inside the mitochondria. Moving forward, to try and put it all together, if you have low mitochondrial capacity, and I talked about this in my other video on fat oxidation. So if you search fat oxidation on my channel, you'll find the information on that. If you have low mitochondria capacity, so you don't have a lot of it going around, you have a low volume of it, what happens? You have high ADP concentration inside the cell, which is going to drive up PFK, phosphofructokinase, and this is going to activate glycolysis, which is going to increase lactate production, and then this lactate is going to be available as a substrate to go into the mitochondria and be used by the aerobic process, which means that you're going to use less fats, again in the context of this step test. But now if we go to a high mitochondria environment, what happens? The high mitochondria allows you to quickly deal with the ADP that is accumulating at the onset of exercise or at any given intensity, which means compared to a low mitochondrial capacity environment or cell, will have less ADP that is inside the muscle cell. As a result of this, we'll have less PFK activation, and that is going to decrease or not activate glycolysis, which means that lactate production is going to be low, which means that we don't have a lot of substrate to fuel the mitochondria, and that could mean that we go and we use a higher proportion of fat in that situation. So a couple more elements that we want to add here when it comes to the mitochondria. If we look at the fast twitch fibers and the slow twitch fibers, there's a recent paper that came out called Need for Speed that was really interesting and talked about the differences in the respiratory chain of the fast twitch and slow twitch fibers. Essentially, it seems like slow twitch fibers have more complex 1 and fast twitch fibers have more complex 2. Complex 1 is especially good at dealing with lactate, not directly, but through the Cori cycle and the NADH substrate, and it looked like the complex 2 deals with succinate, and they kind of share their substrates, right? Because fast twitch fibers are more glycolytic, they're going to produce more lactate, but that can go into the slow twitch fibers and be oxidized there and be used in their respiratory chain, whereas the slow twitch fibers, they're going to do well with using the substrate, turning it into succinate, and then potentially pushing that to the fast twitch fibers to be used in the respiratory chain over there. And remember how muscle fibers get used. We can think of the Henneman principle, the size principle, where the slow twitch fibers get recruited, or the small motor units get recruited at low intensity, primarily attached to slow twitch fibers, and those will favor oxidative metabolism simply because of how they're made. And as you move up in intensity, you're going to go to bigger and bigger motor units, and those will be more and more linked to fast twitch fibers. So we have that intensity spectrum. And if we think about the low intensity that we've been focusing on here in this presentation, well, we understand that mostly slow twitch fiber will be recruited at the low intensity. They have a highly aerobic profile or predisposition. And so they're well able to use up the lactate that is there. And again, leave room for the fat oxidation as well. That is going to be part of the process. And more concretely, if we think about our body stores in fats here on the left and in glycogen on the right, we have a lot more, about 30 times, at least 30 times more fat available than glycogen. And this is one reason to build your mitochondrial capacity, because it is going to spare your glycogen and it's going to allow you to keep it for later on when you actually need it in a race, for example, or at the end of an event or at the end of a weekend where you're competing, depending on the sport that you're in. So if we think about fat oxidation and the use of sugar inside the body, both are important. We saw that they both work in tandem right from the onset of exercise. Everything gets used together, but it does seem like if you have more mitochondria, if you can spare your glycogen for longer, you're gonna obviously use more fat as a result of that, and also perform better, especially in longer events. So we see here the fats and the glycogen. So if we want to sum up the question for the day, why does lactate drop at low intensity in the context of an incremental step test, as we can see in those different data? So my hypothesis is that in endurance trained individuals, blood lactate drops before the first lactate threshold, which is zone 2. This is because in high mitochondrial capacity individuals or fibers, glycolysis is inhibited due to the high ATP ADP ratio at those intensities, resulting in a lack of glycolytic substrate to fuel the effort. This lack of lactate and pyruvate is compensated by free fatty acid utilization. So again, this is a working hypothesis. I had a podcast yesterday I recorded with Coley Moore. If you're in the cycling world, you probably have heard of or listened to the Empirical Cycling podcast. If you haven't, I highly recommend that you do. And I presented this idea to him. He disagreed with it, and he gave some really good arguments, which I think were more focused on the modern model of bioenergetics, which I mentioned a little bit previously. But it doesn't mean that what I'm saying here is correct. It might be wrong. And I think it's just interesting to share those ideas, because this is how we're going to be able to grow and move forward as a field of exercise science. So let me know in the comments what you think. Does that make sense to you? Does it not make sense to you? Do you have conflicting evidence to share? I'd be more than happy to hear it and continue this exchange with you guys. In the meantime, I hope you're well, and I'll see you in the next video.